Welcome at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name is Nina Poels. I'm an assistant research analyst here for East Africa. I'm very happy to welcome today Professor Stig Hansen. Stig Hansen is an associate professor in international relations at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences and author of both Al-Shabaab in Somalia and his latest book, Horn, Sahel and the Rift, Fault Lines of the African Jihad, which draws on his extensive field research across the region. Professor Hansen has previously been a research fellow at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School and has served as an advisor on security policy and piracy to several governments. So thank you so much for being here, and we'd like to hear what you have to tell us today.
Yeah. Thank you for inviting me. Today's talk is going to be based on ongoing research project that is on the verge of being wrapped up, that resulted in several publications. One of them is the book that I humbly put the picture of behind me. There's also an article spanning some of these issues in the Armed Forces and Society. And the research project itself basically focused on the war economy going around these fractions. And my book is focusing, as well as this lecture is focusing on basically jihadist organizations, violent jihadist organizations in Africa. So what spurred me into this discussion was some of the questions that I stumbled upon while doing research in Africa. One of them was why, after more than 21 years, has there been so little success in the war against these organizations? I started to study the Harakat al-Shabaab as early as in 2005. You have the inception of Boko Haram, 2003, 2004. You have the old ADF, which is a little bit strange, the strange organization in this lot, starting perhaps as early as in 1994. Ladies and gentlemen, what these organizations have in common is that they've never been defeated. What they also have in common is that the predictions of their defeat has been frequent and almost, in some cases, annually. So the Sheba was predicted to die in December 2006. It was predicted to die after the peace agreement in 2009. It was predicted to die in 2013, 2012. It's still predicted to die by several experts, especially experts with some kind of connections with some of the government in the region. It's similar with Boko Haram. Boko Haram was predicted to die in 2009. It was predicted to die in 2013. It was predicted to die in 2016. Unnecessary to tell all of you, perhaps they are not dead yet. They transformed, but they are not dead. And that also goes for the IDF and a lot of others of the affiliates. So what's interesting here is basically why are we so bad at defeating them? But also for me, it's curious to actually look into the mechanism that makes people predict that these organizations are disappearing over and over and over again. In my quest to look into these issues, I also encountered several other interesting issues that I touched about. Firstly, the discussion about ungoverned spaces. There was an argument in the literature, maybe 10, 15 years back, criticized quite heavily about the ungoverned spaces thesis that basically claims that areas that doesn't have a proper government is more prone to jihadist organizations than other areas. And it's interesting to look at this a little bit detached, because what was discussed in that debate was very often the conceptualization of governed and what's ungoverned and what's governed. And the criticism against this thesis was to a certain extent valid. It was basically that you have some form of governance at a lot of different places. So ethnic governance, tribal institutions, clan institutions, etc., etc. I nevertheless didn't want to dismiss that thesis out of hand. You have organizations in places like Kenya, you have organizations in places as Tanzania, which is clearly not ungoverned, but it doesn't mean that ungoverned spaces, or rather spaces with weak governance, does something to those organizations. I also wanted to enter into a debate that grown quite hot as of late, basically the local global debate. How local are these organizations? What do their global networks consist of? And now you actually have an ongoing debate about Boko Haram that it has turned out to be quite intensive amongst the academic community, or at least among some members of the academic community. And basically, my main argument after studying Boko Haram, after studying the ADF, after studying the Kenyan Al-Hijra, after studying JNIM and its various affiliates, after studying the Islamic State in Somalia, after studying the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, and after studying Harakat al-Shabaab, is that very often when we talk about defeats, we talk about organizational transformations. Very often we mistake defeats and we don't manage to separate them from what is organizational transformations. And what we don't understand in dealing with these organizations is basically organizational transformations that leads to different situations. One of the things that I picked up on when I was traveling in East Africa is a lot of donors, a lot of implementers of, for example, de-radicalization projects. They claim that they need to have some kind of foundation for the de-radicalization projects in theory, and then very often they pick up theories coming out of Europe dealing with one form of organization. But you have several forms of organizational structures depending on what kind of local presence you have. So I try to make some kind of ideal types. If I can do this a little bit unstructured, if I might, I can start with one form of organization, which is the Clandestine Network, which is basically what we are geared towards here in the West, in Europe, in the United States, but also indeed in East Asia, in Oceania. So it is a kind of organization that is heavily theoretized, actually. And basically what you are facing in such a situation is basically a state that are relatively efficient, a state that has police services that can investigate the various extremist organizations, a state that actually can follow up and is hostile towards these organizations. And this is maybe a little bit mundane knowledge for you, because this is what we are used to, but that also gives an ideal type with certain traits. One of the traits is small group dynamics. Small group dynamics is very important here. Why? Because you need to organize such an organization in such a case, basically clandestine. It needs to be clandestine, and that means you have actually weaker channels of command. You have actually weaker tools from the organization in question to discipline its smaller cells because it cannot be open. And you have much more vulnerability towards small group action, small group dynamics. So there's a lot of literature analyzing this in the case of Europe, where they're talking about how leaders interact, how a group can collapse because the leader does something stupid. For example, there's quarrels over girlfriends, there's quarrels in these small groups over money, so that the group can maybe collapse by itself. It's also hard to discipline such small groups ideologically when it comes to deviation from a standard ideology, so it's a little bit floating. On the other hand, it's harder to enter these groups, so it's more commitment involved in relations to entering these groups. Ladies and gentlemen, a lot of the literature that we find here in Europe is dealing with such groups. De-radicalization programs here are dealing with such groups, and to a certain extent also countering violent extremism. So in one sense, the reason I'm starting with this is that this is more or less our normal state today for us in our continent. But you have several variations. And one of them that I think is very important in Africa that is easily forgotten is basically what I call the accepted presence. That's basically a group that is accepted, perfectly legal in the place where it operates, and ladies and gentlemen, sometimes have delegated heavy responsibilities from the state. Being an Africanist, basically, this is not a too uncommon argument in relations to study of the African state. The delegation of power to non-state actors, sometimes armed non-state actors. So in my book, I'm turning a little bit the argument on the head with Al-Qaeda. I have a separate chapter on Al-Qaeda's affiliation with Sudan, the Sudanese, which I think has been underexplored in the literature. But my argument, thoroughly based on primary sources in that case, is basically that Al-Qaeda functioned as a kind of governance structure for the Sudanese state. Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, they were building roads, they were providing loans, and if you saw a Sudanese armed engagement in Africa, very often Al-Qaeda will follow in those footsteps. So I'm exploring the Eritrean Islamic Jihad, which was a Sudanese ally in relations to Eritrea at the time, and how Al-Qaeda came in and actually engaged with Eritrean Islamic Jihad. And I also am exploring the Al-Ittihad al-Islamiyya, an organization that arguably had a lot of relations in the 80s with the Sudanese, before Al-Qaeda entered into it, and entered into a close relationship with Al-Qaeda also. And ladies and gentlemen, if you go to Boko Haram, I wouldn't say that Boko Haram was without issues with the government, but we should remember that they were legal from at least 2003 until 2009. They were a legal organization. There are rumors about engagement with the local governance structures in that period, but I'm not sure if that's valid, but it's important to keep it in mind at least. But they were legal. They were perfectly legal. They have clashes with the local police at times, but legal. And in relations to northern Mali, you have some of the same issues, where you actually had Akim having some kind of relationship with the central government, and times seen coming out of the WikiLeaks, seen as a kind of tool that can be used to stop Algerian influence, and seen as a kind of tool to curtail some of the Tuareg organizations. So a kind of tool. I have several conclusions with regards to this. The first is, maybe some of you would think that this accepted presence is not really that interesting today because you have the international pressure. It's hard to do it. I would agree with you that maybe today it's not so important, but I would caution as we proceed, and as some of these conflicts that we had in the first 2 decades of this century actually become more and more forgotten. Maybe you will see a stronger regional rivalry. Maybe for some actors the Chinese-United States rivalry will become more important as well. And then maybe some actors will start looking for allies that can be used in the same way again. That's something that we should keep in mind, and that actually you had the state affiliation at some stages. The second thing I would like to stress is that it gives some big advantages for the organizations. You can have the organizational hierarchy in the open. You can have organizational disciplining in the open. It gives some drawbacks as well because you're dependent on the host state. So if you look into Sudan, it wasn't for Sudan and Al-Qaeda, it wasn't anything goes. So you have the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group that Al-Qaeda wanted to ally with that basically they were refused to ally with because of the Sudanese government's pressure. And you also, of course, the eviction of Osama bin Laden also illustrates the weakness of such a status, basically that you can have some international pressure. We also have a very interesting postdoc at my institution who looked into attempts in the Sudanese society to counter that type of ideology, even during the years that Al-Qaeda was closer to the Sudanese government. So there are limitations, although you have an accepted status as well. You cannot outdo the state. The state will, that you have a somewhat good relationship with, they will not accept any transgressions. You know, there will be some kind of control from your potential friend, the state. So this is easily forgotten, this type of territorial presence. And perhaps when you move away from these two types, which is basically more peace-related, you go into a more civil wars type of scenario, you get into something called semi-territoriality. And basically, semi-territoriality is the key for me to understand why, after 21 years, not a single of the African jihadist organizations have been defeated. That all of them are still, I would say, pretty much blossoming today. You might argue with that later, but they are not on the verge of defeat. They are doing quite well. And semi-territoriality is kind of neglected. It's basically a situation where you have jihadist organizations like Shebab today, existing in facing a superior army. The Shebab will face the AMISOM. Shebab can never hope to defeat the AMISOM in open combat. And now you're getting closer to a stage where it can have problems with elements of the Somali army, even defeating them in open combat. But last summer I had an interesting meeting with the president of the Southwestern Regional State, Sheriff, and he told me that his worry was the so-called flyover territories. Basically that the countryside was left alone by AMISOM soldiers who bunkered up in big bases because they wanted to keep their own forces safe. They wanted to be tactically sound. And there are several elements that can lead to such a situation. One element is that basically you want to protect your own forces. It's something to do with tactical deployment. And second element is basically that you save money doing it. And a third element is basically that you lack capacity to provide local security. But when you don't engage the villages in the countryside, what happens then is that they have to hedge against the jihadist organization in question. And my claim, ladies and gentlemen, is very often we look to these big, gigantic conspiracies when it comes to income generation for some of these organizations. Share call, it was important. Illegal eco-crimes in relation to Shebab, drug export. Very often the biggest source of income will be checkpoints in the countryside, and it will be taxing of local villages. And the problem with semi-territoriality, ladies and gentlemen, is basically that the media, and sometimes us, unfortunately, like to highlight big explosions in bigger cities in Africa, big terrorist attacks. But my claim is if we want to understand why these organizations are surviving, it's basically the taxing of the local villages, the engagement in the local villages, that is the explanation. It's not these big terrorist attacks. It's kind of deflecting from what's really important. What very often happens is that the countryside is left alone. What happens next is that these villages have to hedge against the organization in question. What do you do in such a situation? Very often you have some kind of governance, clan governance or something like that. You can provide your recruits to the organization you're facing. That's a survival strategy, ladies and gentlemen. If you put in the recruits, you have influence in the organization. So if you give your sons to that organization, you gain influence. So it's a strategy to survive. Secondly, you can give away your daughters in marriage. That's also a survival strategy to a certain extent. Whatever you do, you should pay your taxes and provide them with some kind of items that they need. So in one sense, this leads to a major problem, the stage of semi-territoriality, because you have a local integration into those organizations. And that takes place over time, and it needs heavy detachment, and it needs to be worked on very thoroughly to cut some of these contact lines. Yet it is a strategy to protect themselves by the local population. Sometimes you can see local social groupings like clans trying to take over these organizations at a local level. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes they can even have some small amount of success. So there's a kind of interaction there that is very unfortunate. But my claim is that we will sit and have a similar discussions in 10 years' time if we don't deal with this problem. The last ideal type that I want to introduce to you today is basically the ideal type of territoriality, territorial control. You have a lot of seminal work done on this. It was a kind of fashion in the expert community to study this when the Islamic State took control in Iraq and Syria. I would like to remind the audience that Al-Shabaab was far ahead of the Islamic State in doing this. They started that development in 2009, expanding themselves, creating also easily forgotten by analysts systems of governance that were relatively effective compared to some of the alternatives. So, for example, the Shabaab will create courts that are still used by people in Mogadishu today because they are good at implementing compared with the state courts of the Somali state. So they created an alternative type of governance that sometimes could rival the states that they were basically competing with. And this is sometimes neglected. The Shabaab were strong at doing this. You have similar tendencies in the north of Mali, I think with Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda at the time, not all over north of Mali, but in some areas. And easily forgotten today is that these type of rhetorics were also important for the Boko Haram, at least until 2009. After 2009 it changed, and arguably it seems like it's becoming more important for Boko Haram today as they are expanding, because they are expanding. Basically, but the weakness of having this territorial control, the strength is that you can create territories, you can attract foreign fighters, you can actually do indoctrination, and foreign fighters have been important, for example, for Al-Shabaab when they were spreading to Tanzania and Kenya. But the weakness, it's never been accepted by the international community in Africa so far. So what you get if you do take territory and hold territory is inevitably, and it's always happened in Africa, you get some form of international intervention. Other countries will intervene. It's not necessary that it's France who is intervening or any Western powers, but regionally they will come. So territoriality will not be a lasting effect, but it gives some advantages. One of the weaknesses that I've seen with the literature so far is to mistake these interventions when they really quell and stop territoriality for utter defeat of the organizations involved. What happens is rather a transformation back to semi-territoriality. And some of you might say, when I develop these ideal types, why don't I use other terms like revolutionary movements, like insurgency? I want you to keep in mind that really the accepted presence and clandestine network type of scenarios, they are not really insurgent scenarios. You don't need heavy losses in those two scenarios. There might be relatively peaceful relations in those scenarios. To just sum it up, when it comes to accepted presence, consequences for countermeasures, basically, countermeasures, you could have some kind of international pressures. You can also have regional cooperation. I had the pleasure of doing a speak on these ideal types at the University of Ruhuna just 7 days ago, and the way that these organizations have been sponsored by state actors in South Asia was also very, very weird and a kind of a surprise for me. And the tool here is some kind of regional cooperation as well, to get various countries to sign agreements to stop doing this, basically. And it's also an issue of intelligence development, that really not all the countries in question that host such groups are really aware of what those groups are at the local level. They might not be on their agenda at the central level. I would say that you have de-radicalization programs. There are possibilities from de-radicalization and disengagement programs, as shown by the Sudan example, but very heavy to implement. So I still think we should keep that in mind for the future, because I think they might re-emerge. I basically, to sum up, basically the clandestine network example, it's basically, we should keep in mind that this is an example that is in Africa. You can have relatively efficient security services in Africa. You will have it in Ethiopia. You will have somewhat weaker security and policing services in Kenya, but they're still relatively capable. It's not like Somalia. It's a different situation. You will have them in Tanzania, and that's where really the Western competence can be transferred to a certain extent, because it's very kind of similar to the Western situation. Basically, if you have a clandestine network, your taxation will be limited. You cannot excel on taxation because the state will investigate if you try to tax. You can have some kind of protection rackets, but there will be limitations to it. You will have sanctions against exit of the organization. They will also be limited, because basically if you run away from the Hijira in Kenya, you can try to run to the police or other organizations that you can try to hope to get some protection out. Today, after September 11th, it will also strain the amount of money that you can transfer. It needs to be clandestine. It needs to avoid our financial transaction services. And as I said, command hierarchy is weak, and this might hurt internal cohesion. And in the literature, small group dynamics are highlighted, and also in the literature for these small groups, there's limited training capacity. Sometimes the training capacities will be in other situations where you actually send out foreign fighters that can come home. But the strength of the clandestine networks is that they are closer to terrorist targets, like in Kenya. In this semi-territoriality scenario, basically, as I said, you can have a situation where you have the state lack capacity or the state lacks will, or where you have casualty awareness, aware strategies that try to minimize losses by abandoning the countryside. And it's quite common today. And then actually the organization in question have a large taxation potential. They will have sanctions against exit. So normal de-radicalization programs will not function. They have to be tooled in a different way. They will have some kind of ability to change money, and you will have a strong command hierarchy if there's are group dynamics that are unfortunate within, for example, squadron level units. The bigger organization will react against that. They can counter that. So these small group dynamics become less important. You will have some kind of training capacity, but you will be far away from the proximity to terrorist targets. But you will also have operational freedom, and you could enjoy an embeddedness in local society. An embeddedness that it's not only advantageous for these organizations, as I said, it will hamper them operationally sometimes as well. And the closer you get to the local society, the more harder it is also for you to move if you have to move into another area. And because you are more able to tax, you will attract a lot of opportunists. Basically, poor people who want to have employment, basically also people who want to lead financial income gathering, because it might be profitable. You might actually receive some pay in joining these organizations, and it will be at a relatively stable level. And then you have territorial presence, and that is heavily investigated in the literature after the rise of the Islamic State. You have a special issue of terrorist perspectives, where you had this discussion around the jihadi proto-state by Bin Aliyah. I won't say that this is the proto-state. I really like that issue, by the way, but I don't like the expression Islamic proto-state or jihadi state. The reason is that, first and foremost, several of these entities don't really claim statehood. They don't want to claim statehood. Secondly, that the way of control is more loose very often. Very often you have delegated violence rather than full monopoly of violence. So it doesn't resemble a normal state in any ways. So, but still, it provides the organization with a kind of governance possibility, and very often they will grasp that governance possibility and create some kind of governance structure. Very often it will be Sharia courts and some form of justice implementation. As I said, in Africa, there's a lot of examples, but this always resulted in international or regional action. And territorial control is well known for us now because of the Syrian case. Basically, you will have a large potential for taxation. You will have to pay tax in order to survive. You have sanctions against exit. The organization will have strong sanctions against exit. You will have ability to channel money. You can have a strong command hierarchy. And a strong command hierarchy will mean that the organization have other tools to deal with negative group dynamics. You can have training capacities, and you can have the training of foreign fighters that can be also returned to their areas of origin and creating networks around the continent. And high operational freedom. You have embeddedness and opportunism like you have in the case of semi-territoriality as well. But you have the possibility to shine when it comes to, and I'm doing this to provoke you a little bit, good governance. Because I think in some cases these organizations have been better at governing than some of the alternatives. Especially in the case of Somalia, when you talk about the Somali transitional federal government and indeed the current government. And you will try to, and this is neglected by a lot of us, by the way, because you can find it in the so-called jihadist videos of Africa, highlighting crime prevention. Jainim will do that, Shebab will do that, and Boko Haram started to do that very late, but they started to do that, and before 2009 they also talked a lot about preventing corruption and crime prevention. And what you see is you also have this idea of a golden age if they do good governance, when they had territorial control, and that might be of value as they lose this territoriality as well. I do think, basically, to sum up, that these transitions are very important for us today. Secondly, it's a mistake to put a de-radicalization or a CVE program tailor-made for clandestine networks into the African context if you don't have a similar situation, and that happens a lot. You know, demobilization, reintegration, disarmament program is probably more suited, but then you have to acknowledge this type of embeddedness that are there and the threats that you can actually face outside of the capitals that you very often host these type of programs in the countryside. I do think, as I said, that if the income gathering possibilities of these organizations in the countryside are neglected, if village security are continuously neglected, if we continue with those mistakes, I'm afraid maybe we will sit here in 10 years' time and have a similar discussions. You know, we focus too much on two different things, basically. One is to defeat these organizations in open combat, in military battles. That's not how it works. You cannot defeat them like that. The secondly, ladies and gentlemen, is equally serious. It's to throw a lot of development money into those areas without thinking about how they are doing. You know, the results and the solutions have to be different. And we need to think about human security, and we need to think about the insecurity in the countryside. That means that we need to be a little bit less interested in the big terrorist attacks in larger capitals. We need to be a little bit more interested in the rural areas. That's basically my main message of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for this incredibly interesting and detailed talk that really clearly shows how territorial control of armed groups affects their operations. Before moving to the audience for the Q&A, I would like to take the opportunity to ask a question of my own. My question would be, and very Somalia specific, with the planned, initially AMISOM was planned to withdraw from Somalia in 2020, but has now been postponed to 2021, and who knows, it might be postponed further. But if they withdraw in 2021, how might this affect, because you identify Al-Shabaab now as an organization with semi-territorial control. Do you think this would give them the opportunity to again transform into a movement with full territorial control?
It's, as probably you are aware of, it's a very good question. And I want to highlight some of the parameters. Today, ladies and gentlemen, Al-Shabaab is a richer organization than ever before. They're very good at taxing, and they tax in Mogadishu. They tax better in Mogadishu than the government. So they're richer than before. They're not as military strong as they used to be, but money can sometimes be translated into power, and they're not weak in a military sense either. The Somali army it's still very poor, but it's getting slightly better. It's going from a very, very poor state to a very poor state. I do still suspect that it's dependent on the AMISOM forces to support it. So I do expect that you will have a collapse around in Somalia. What the joker here is really some of the regional states. So the Yuba state fended for itself against the Shabaab before, and it will fend for itself against the Shabaab again. And the same thing, of course, goes for Puntland. You know, some of these regional entities, they will stand, I think. That's my prediction. I have somewhat more bleaker predictions for Mogadishu, but I would like to acknowledge that the Somali army is getting a little bit better. It's getting a little bit better. So there is some positive development, but it's not enough yet. Yeah.
Thank you. Then I'd like to move to the audience for questions. I will take 3 questions, and then if that's okay, then please go ahead. When asking the questions, please state your name and affiliation.
Thank you very much indeed, and emphasis on indeed. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst. I've worked in Yemen, Tanzania, and very briefly in Puntland. My question is partly based in that experience. That was last year. I I didn't apply for a job, I was contacted about filling a post. I went out there, realised it was so abominable, the organisation, not the Puntland authorities, and I walked out after a week. I thought, if this is the situation, this is completely hopeless. So my question is, you mentioned at the end how the development process, assistance at the moment, is not terribly realistic and focused on the situations on the ground. Do you see any signs of improvement in the understanding of what you are saying? I've found both the European Union and even more so the UN, there really is a huge gap between the developmental mindset and the security and military, and really you're reinforcing the point, we've got a long way to go, because this is still a huge gap after all these years. Are there any positive signs, perhaps based on the UN being given a shake-up given the recent corruption scandals in Yemen, Sudan and the Palestinian Authority, UN programs there? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. To give everyone the opportunity to ask a question, I would like to restate to keep questions to questions and not comments. Are there any more questions? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sanjay Puran, LSE. I just recently returned from the Caribbean, working for the WHO. There's this impression that I've coined the phrase Calypso Caliphate. You see ISIS actually one step ahead of the game and embed themselves in the legitimate government structures in the Western world, in the Caribbean. How do you see one way to tackle this? Because they've actually aligned themselves now with a very strong drug trade. Here we go, my question comes next. You're finding that, especially in Trinidad, ISIS now, the recruits, have aligned themselves with the drug trade that's been strengthened over 50 years. How do we move forward to ensure that ISIS are not 5-10 steps ahead of our fight against them?
Please go ahead.
My name is Jordan Anderson, so I work for IHS Market, or Jane's, Central and East Africa. So you highlighted the pitfalls of judging an armed group by how big bombs can it set off in Mogadishu. Obviously, the temptation to do that a lot of the time comes from the fact that it's very easy to judge. You can see it, you can judge the size of the bomb, you can quantify it, track it. How do you think, or what do you recommend in terms of then, in a way of judging or assessing an organization based on its strength in the countryside? So how do you go about determining how well is it raising money, or what are some of the things you can look at, as those things are often hard to measure?
Okay. Yes, I will start with a gentleman with some experience from Puntland. I would say firstly that when it comes to Puntland, I'm a little bit more positive than you. And there's reasons for that. Firstly, you came in the period of Abdi Weli Gas, I think. And I've been traveling on Puntland since 1998, and he is either the worst Puntland president ever or the second worst Puntland president ever. You know, you have to, in order to have police forces, you need to pay the police forces. That's very important, and I think the audience, most of us will understand that. And he neglected that, so I'm kind of positive a little bit. I hope that Dini can fix things better.
They had good people.
Yes, so that's one thing. But the hidden strength of Puntland that we very often forget, that also is the hidden strength of Somaliland when it comes to the law enforcement. If you need it, if you can mobilize it, it's actually because you have some kind of clan consensus. If you need it very heavily for a task, if there's desperation, you can actually call upon some of the clan militias to aid you. And this shouldn't be fully underestimated. It shouldn't be fully underestimated. And this is, ladies and gentlemen, something that the transitional government, I won't call it transitional, it's the federal government, at times lacks totally in Mogadishu. They are paid the troops, maybe they pay the troops sometimes, not always, but what they do lack is some kind of this wider commitment that you actually have in Puntland, some kind of consensus around the institutions, strong consensus, or let me say consensus around the institutions that can help Puntland in times of crisis. And the question about signs of improvements, I think there are some forms of improvement. I've been following the UN in Somalia for quite a while. I see that they kind of try to keep tracks on some of the NGOs that are problematic, but it's a cumbersome organization. One of the problems with the UN, I think, ladies and gentlemen, is the 2 to 4 year contracts that they operate with. Why do I think that is the problem? Because it's harder to arouse criticism within the organization. You know, you are dependent on renewing your contract. It's harder to raise criticism and get it up in the organization. And there's also, as I'm sure that from the comments and questions I got from you, I'm sure that there's a lot of people in the audience that are aware of this. There's also some kind of self-interest in the system for actually highlighting a project as good so that you can get more funding and so that you can have a stable position because you're dependent on that funding. So it's some kind of perverse incentives that we need to deal with. I think we've gotten beyond that, but in the past, and that's also progress, in the past very often the UN agencies were accepted as having some kind of neutral expertise. I think we should also look at the UN agencies' biases, and I think this is coming much more strongly forward today than it used to be. It doesn't mean that we need to be negative towards the UN as an organization. It rather requires us to be basically professional and think about what works and what's not working. And that's where I see some kind of progress. You know, there's much more reflections around that, also sometimes within the UN system. But I do think some of the structures in some of the larger aid organizations, as well as the UN, it hinders some of these processes. And but maybe if we know it, maybe we can do something about it. The Islamic State. I'm very interested in the Caribbean, but I don't know much about it, so I have to restrain my comments to Africa. And the Islamic State in Africa is a strange creation. Let me rephrase myself. The Islamic State in sub-Saharan Africa is a strange creation. Ladies and gentlemen, in the countries where you had stronger long-term Al-Qaeda affiliates, like Al-Shabaab, but also Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, these Islamic State affiliates that appear, they be very weak. They are weak, and in the case of Mali, rather pragmatic. So I would say that in the case of Mali, maybe you will have some pressure towards doing that. But they are not that strong and that well situated to fully take advantage of it. It's such a small organization in Mali, and it was weak. At the start, it was pushed around, and now it's doing what Al-Qaeda tells them to do, very often at least. And in Puntland, if anything, the situation is the same, because I would say the Islamic State in Somalia is basically based in Puntland. That's what we know about, and they have offshoots other places, but they are mainly based there, and they are very weak, and they can survive partly because of the terrain. So they are not that well situated to take advantage of some of these issues. And you might say, no, well, hold on, Puntland was a pirate area, it's a weapon smugglers area. But the thing is, some of these old pirates groups and some of the heroin smugglers, they are simply stronger than the Islamic State, and they are not interested in basically paying anything to them. So that they are strong, some of these actors are still strong locally. And because there is a flow of heroin coming into East Africa that some of them take advantage of. And the quantify question is a brilliant question. Again, it's a very good question. You know, it's so easy to count these bumps. And especially if maybe we all been there, we have a deadline, we sit in our office and we want to produce this report. I think it's very important to actually interview people and have connections with people that comes out of these areas. It's very important. And it's not, unfortunately, everybody who can go to Mogadishu and be there on the ground and talk to some of these refugees. But then the alternative is to put up a contact network that you actually contact each time with people from that area, which is hard, because you know what, if you, for example, go to northern Mali, or if you go to Somalia, you need to kind of triangulate between the various in the case of northern Mali, castes and the various Tuareg tribes and other also social groupings. So you need to have some kind of triangulation. But my experience is that it's good to talk to clan elders, it's good to talk to religious leaders, and it is good to talk to local journalists as well. And then you try to triangulate between the different sources. I think you need to do that. It's a very important to move. It's not easy, and we all have deadlines, so I have large sympathy with you, but we need to go beyond that. And I also think that Jains will be rewarded when people see that they are actually predicting better than others. So some kind of local engagement and some kind of qualified local engagement that doesn't depend on one gatekeeper, but rather pick different people from different groups with experience from the area to talk to, not only one person. That's the danger, very dangerous situation. Yeah, that's, yeah.
Thank you. Lady in the back in the middle.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I found the categorization useful, but I guess from a policy perspective, I'm interested, how much do you think our failure to defeat or tackle these organisations is based on a failure to understand their transformations and the fact that territorial defeat doesn't mean actual defeat? Or is it more based on an unwillingness to mobilise resources and change invested interest in actually addressing the problems that need to be addressed?
Thanks. And thank you as well. I'm Emily, I'm from Control Risks. I had a question about the types of financing that you're seeing between these groups and communities, especially rural communities, to see whether the types of taxation vary depending on territoriality. So, for example, you talked a little bit about taxation as a method of financing groups, and I'm thinking also that there's a bit of a spectrum from taxation to extortion, so asking for protection payment from local businesses, agricultural producers, and then up to things like kidnap for ransom in other areas. Do you see that the groups using like all of those tactics in the same places, or does that vary depending on their level of control, their level of links with local communities? I'd be really interested in your thoughts.
Ali Arsalan Pasha, I'm an intern at the IISS. I found your categories to be very interesting. So just two small questions based on that. Is there a condition where the state and the resistance are both strong and not complicit with each other? Because I thought that was a category that was not there. And secondly, how much lateral mobility is there between these categories? Does it happen in such conditions like we've seen in Waziristan or in Kholistan or in the Naxalite movement, that you can move between different categories?
Yeah. Again, very good questions. This issue of how much is it to do with will, and how much, if I get you right, and how much is it to do with the transformation itself. I think, sometimes I wonder if there's actually an instrumental interest in neglecting that transformation itself. To say that you actually, it's nice to do like Holland, to go on TV and say that you defeated all the jihadists in northern Mali. It's nice to say that you have this final solution. So sometimes I wonder if there's some kind of self-interest in not acknowledging this transformation also. I do think that maybe the key here is not to that the survival is caused by the transformation. It's rather that our countermeasures is not tailor-made according to which stage that organization is in. So you need different tools for semi-territoriality. And there's the key. You need to tool these tools. The thing is that you question about the lack of will to commit. It's also very important. Because in some cases, these states never committed to those areas. You have a history of not committing. You have a history to delegate security. So you have that dilemma that you have to actually get them to do something that they never did. You can argue that that's the case for Afghanistan as well. The Afghanistan state in Helmand. Okay. We can discuss that later. Yes, and so the lack of will is definitively there, and if you have to combat them, you have to get will to commit resources, and you have to sometime that lack of will have to be taken into consideration. And there's a tool that I've been discussing a little bit with myself, but it probably is needed, and that's some kind of delegation to local security institutions as well. It's a heavy step. It's not perfect. But if you want to have people with a will to commit, maybe that's the people you need to empower those people that feels the negative consequences. That's the thing. And we had a question about the balance between kidnapping and ransom and protection money. I think it's the difference between protection money and taxation, doesn't always run that deep. Some of you might be aware of Charles Tilly when he talked about early European states, and he said early European states were protection rackets, basically, which was the argument of Pope Gregor VII when he was discussing with Henry IV in the medieval times. So you had this idea that you need to gather money from the locals, and so the separation between protection money and taxing is not entirely clear, So you might call it protection money, and it might be fair to call it protection money, but you can also refer to it as tax. What you have to do is to pay it all the time. And the thing is, you will get some services in return. Sometimes you will get better services than the state. And that is the case in Somalia today. I had a friend in a Somali court case, in a Somali civil court case, who overheard a party to the court case going to the judge, and he says, "What should I do with this verdict? It will never be implemented." And the judge told him, and the Somali judge told him that, "You know what? If you have problems with that, you can take it to the Shebab court." So that was a Somali judge who was telling one of the participants to take it to the Shebab court because they could implement. So you will get some kind of services from it, and it's not popular to say, but it's something we should keep in mind. Not all of these organizations provide the equal amount of services, though. Shebab had this Sharia court, not always perfect. Boko Haram had a far less interest in that. But as I talked about this in the past, before 2009, at least it was most important. It was important in their rhetorics, but after 2009, it kind of disappeared for practical purposes. And what we can see now in ISWAP is basically Barnavi's ISWAP is basically getting much more of this rhetoric again. So it's back to a little bit to the roots when it comes to this rhetoric. So we might see some kind of attempts on institutionalizing this in ISWAP in the future. We will see. Basically, what happens if you have a strong state and if you have a strong jihadist organization? The thing is, that might leave you with territoriality, because you might have an enclave totally controlled by that organization. So then you have territoriality over an area, but you cannot control the full state, but you will have a territoriality. And that's basically the case, I think. That's basically... it's not many clear examples of that in Africa yet, but it's a theoretical possibility. Maybe we will see it in the future. Maybe you can see it in Afghanistan. We can discuss that later, maybe. Yeah.
So we have 5 more minutes left, which I would say leaves us enough time for maybe 2 more questions.
Assistant research analyst here at IISS, and I focus on the Sahel. So I have 2 questions actually, very short. One is on Lake Chad. So you talked about how it's important for the state presence in rural areas and prison and delivering services there. So how do you explain the new super camp strategy that Nigeria recently put in place, which is doing the exact opposite, concentrating all their forces in a few bases away from the countryside? And the second question is on Mali and IQIM and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. They're obviously spreading, and they've spread quicker than we thought in Burkina Faso. How do you think it will spread further south to coastal West Africa? Is it a real threat? And how fast and deep are they going to go, in your opinion?
Anyone else?
I think
Thank you very much for the presentation. My name is Andre Busano, an intern at ISS, and my question is regarding the effectiveness of peacekeeping programs. So MINUSMA is seen as a program with the highest level of fatalities, and I was wondering which ways could be used to improve this type of programs to increase the effectiveness in the region.
Yeah, I think it's the first question about the super camps. It's to start with that. There's something we should be aware of because we owe it to ourselves. We're sitting here, most of us as representatives, not representatives, but members in countries that are, for example, engaged in NATO, that still are in the EU, although it might change very soon. And some of these strategies are our strategies. It's strategies that we have been teaching these countries through military support programs. You know, this thing about casualty awareness, this thing about tactical security, etc., etc. You know, the super camp strategy is good at saving Nigerian army lives, but it's a disaster for the to fight Boko Haram. You know, to create these big super camps and not engaged with the local population. That's basically some of the things that the Nigerian state managed to do in 2012, and it didn't work out very well. You know, they were thinking in those directions, and they were not engaging the local security structures. They were not engaging the local population, clustering themselves away from the local population. I suspect, I cannot know, but I suspect that the ISWAP leadership and even Shekau are very happy about this. It's a good strategic choice for them, and I envisage that we will still see a blossom. We haven't seen the last of ISWAP. You know, they are still going to expand, and the Nigerian relationship to truth is also sometimes a little bit, as we talked about, it's a little bit problematic, where you actually have a lot of cities that, according to them, are under their control, but local journalists will say that they are not. So it's a problem. You know, if anything, they are the ones who really need to enter into thinking about these local protection arrangements. They need to go local, and what they do is go super camp instead. So again, coming back to my gloomy predictions for the future, this is not going to work out very well. For the spread of these organizations in West Africa is also a very interesting question. If you see in some cases, there was a lot of talk of the spread of Boko Haram, for example, into Niger, into Cameroon. Very often, that was also all the links that was there, and sometimes there are research going into this. They managed to play on ethnic links as well. Not that any ethnic group endorsed them, but just creating some kind of social bonds that they could take advantage of when going into Cameroon, etc., etc. What we see now, and I would like to have your opinion on this afterwards, what we see now in Burkina Faso is a very much Fulani-driven expansion. It's not Fulani-driven, it's driven by minority castes within the Fulani system, basically inferior caste system. It's not fully, they will have other tribes as well, but you can see that dynamics being there when Jafar Kofa is expanding his Ansar. And you might spread through networks further south, but my suspicion is it will take time. And you need to attract these networks, so you need to have some kind of more solid control in the Mopti region. You need to have some solid control in some of the Burkinabe forests before this happens. And I suspect it will take time. It's easier if you have Fulani members in northern Mali to expand into Burkina than it is to expand further south. So I think it will take some time before we see them progress further south. I do think Burkina is in a lot of trouble. I do think Niger is in a lot of trouble also, but it might take time before you see things, for example, going towards Ghana. But I know the Ghanesians are heavily thinking about that. And in fact, the question I had of UN operations runs straightly into the super camp, your super camp comment also, because that's the problem with MINUSMA as well. You know, they cluster up. I saw this ridiculous video on Norwegian TV. We sent 50 soldiers to Bamako in MINUSMA because they were supposed to fight JNIM. And ladies and gentlemen, you don't fight JNIM in Bamako. You know, that's and they had these videos of Norwegian soldiers in full combat gear going through the streets of Bamako and looking very tough, and the local population looking very astonished. So MINUSMA is doing the same type of clustering. You know, there need to be another solution. This is not it's not viable. And before this lecture, I called my local partners in Timbuktu, and they were saying that they left the countryside. They say that if you go 5 kilometers outside of Timbuktu, you can run into Jainim forces, and they would do village patrols even. So this clustering is not good, and we had to think about another way of doing things in Africa. Otherwise, maybe the International Institute of Strategic Studies will invite me here again in 21 years. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I would really like to thank the audience for attending today and your engaging questions. And please join me in thanking Professor Stig Hansen.
Thank you.